Okay. Let me make sure my video is going. All right. So, our second and last deviation in preparation for Christmas. You guys have graciously let me do my Christmas presentation that I wanted to do last year, and we couldn't make it work because of schedules. But I want to first off clarify this is probably going to be the least heartwarming Christmas presentation in the history of Christmas presentations. And I had to ask Mariah, like, you think people are going to be disappointed if it's not like heartwarming Christmas stuff? And her response was, they don't expect anything heartwarming or uplifting out of you. And I was like, that's mean, but fair. So very much a Bible study as opposed to last week, but not exactly a typical Christmas one. But I'm confident there's at least something to get out of it, if not enjoyable. I always like going through this study, and I kind of try to do it every year. So I guess to start it off, I can promise you, at least in this room, with a limited audience and knowing just Christian community generally, this has got to be the most read section of the Bible. And I bet there's not a section of the Bible when we talk about Luke 1 and Matthew 1 and 2 and the Christmas story. I bet there's not any other section of the Bible that you could say most Christians read at least once a year, right? And this pretty fair. We could say most Christians hear or read this once a year, but ask yourself, have you ever, in all the times you've actually read the story, have you ever actually sat down and done a Bible study and tried to understand what it says and spent more than just a feel-good read through that story? And I think that the reality is most people don't. Most people feel like they know it so well because of hearing it every year, and it's the only part of the Bible, most likely, that you've heard every year since you were a kid, that you kind of just take for granted the Christmas story and feel like you really understand the narrative. But I think there's some surprising stuff if you actually take the time to slow down and really read what's there. Just for example, this Isaiah 9:19 is probably on half the Christmas cards that get sent and quoted every year. But really just take a minute to read it. First of all, for unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulders, and his name will be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end, upon the throne of David and over his kingdom, to order it and establish it with judgment and justice from that time forward, even forever. I think that's something that I can guarantee you everyone's heard that time after time, year after year, but really take a minute and think about what it's saying. Unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. Those are two separate things. It is a son of God and a child in contrast to each other, but really the focus of this is on his establishing a kingdom. This is a recommitment of the promise that was made to David, that the Messiah, the King of Israel, would come out of his line, and that he would rule not only for 1,000 years, but forever and ever. And this goes into tremendous detail on establishing his government. But more importantly, this is a very well-known prophecy, both in Christianity and Judaism. And if you take a minute and read it, you start to wonder, how is it that the Jews missed that the Messiah would be God incarnate? They still don't believe that the Messiah is God. They believe he's a messenger from God, that he's sent of God. But this verse says, his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, right? It flat out says that the Messiah that's coming, the child that's going to be born, the son that's going to be given, will be called Mighty God. If that's not God incarnate, then that is blasphemy of the highest order in Judaism. And you wonder, how the heck did they miss it? The Son will be called Everlasting Father? Weird. These don't line up. And that should, yet somehow, despite being a well-known messianic prophecy, you still see today the Jews won't recognize that Christ can be both God incarnate and the Son of God. And it's right there, and we read it over and over and over, and that is, in my mind, the nail in the coffin to anyone that says, well, Jesus never claimed to be God. I don't really care if Jesus claimed to be God. He did. But the prophecies about him literally called him mighty God, everlasting Father. How much more specific can you be that he is God incarnate? And so there's a whole bunch of arguments. There's a whole bunch of theological points that are nailed down in this verse that we quaintly throw on a Christmas card and just kind of pass over as, unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. But I think that's true of the entire Christmas story because we've read it so many times. You can almost memorize it. You just take for granted a lot of things that are being said there. And in my mind, it's worth it to at least once, if not once a year, take a minute and step back and really understand the narrative of it, because I think actually we miss some of the most miraculous parts of the story just by the fact that we think we know it, right? You already think you know the narrative, and you really miss some incredible things that I would call even miracles within the miracle by just not really reading. But can't get into this without throwing in a holiday guilt trip. I don't know if you can go to a church service around Christmas time without it being pointed out that Christmas today, our ideas of Christmas are not Christian in nature. And I don't think we need to beat this into anyone's heads, but it's worth pointing out that as you look around and see the trappings of Christmas, to acknowledge this isn't what it's about, and not just like in a Cindy Lou Who kind of way, but really, I mean, the ornaments, the decorations, the presentation of Christmas is in itself contrary to Christianity. And in fact, we see some of these traditional images of Christmas. If you just look up in Encyclopedia Britannica, the festival of Saturnalia. Saturnalia was a Roman festival celebrating the birth and death of the god Saturn. So it's the sun god. When it was celebrated, Saturnalia was celebrated in December, starting December 17th and expanding over the year to include the entire week up to December 23rd. What's being celebrated? Saturnalia was a time to relax, have fun with feasting, gift-giving, carnival-like atmosphere, roast meats, desserts, wine, chariot races. We don't do much of those these days, but other than that, we're pretty on point here. Gift-giving. One day, the final day, was reserved for the giving of gifts. The masters would serve their slaves at the table, and the king of Saturnalia was elected to be orders of the people and slaves temporarily liberated. The homes were decorated with candles and wreaths. This was all the trappings of Christianity. Was a holiday that goes all the way back to Babylonian times and was carried on through the Greeks to the Roman times. It was a very prevalent celebration in the time. Most of, I will say 90% of the traditions that we think of associated with Christianity come out of the festival of Saturnalia. The Yule log was a young log that was to signify the death of one year and the passing of another, and they would burn the Yule log to celebrate, to kill this year and ring in the new. It was celebrated on December 23rd because it was the end of the cycle, and so the winter was at its longest, and so they were celebrating death of the last and then rebirth, and so it was the day of rebirth. These are all very, very pagan images. And what happened was Constantine comes along, and his successor, his grandson, Constantine, comes along, passes the Edict of Toleration, or the Edict of Milan, where he essentially allows Christianity, and his successor would make Christianity the state religion, but they had a problem because their empire is vast, and 90% of the people in their empire were sun worshipers, were pagans of some kind that celebrated some of these feasts and festivals were very, very important to their culture. So instead of doing away with Saturnalia, they just put Christian names on it. They just said, hey, we're going to call that Christmas and celebrate, instead of rebirth of the sun, we're going to celebrate rebirth of the sun and make that Christmas. And so then the pagans could have their days off and continue their celebrations, and Christianity just kind of melded themselves in, what we call marrying itself to the world. And I think that's fairly well established, the history of it. I'm sure most people are familiar with the origins of it, and the fact that there is nothing when it comes to our traditions and celebrations that doesn't have some ties back to ancient mystery Babylon religion. And it's very important to be aware of it. It begs the question, but does the Bible prohibit traditions? Jeremiah 10:3-4 says, "For the customs of the people are vain. For one cutteth a tree out of the forest, the work of the hands of the workmen with the axe. They deck it with silver and gold. They fasten it with nails and with hammers, that it move not." Good thing we don't do anything like that in our culture, right? Nothing similar. And I mean, these are practices that were common in that time, that were associated with pagan worship, and that the Bible specifically says are imageries of pagan worship. This is vanity of the cutting down of trees, the decking with tinsel and gold, or silver and gold, and fastening it in your living rooms. And yet we continue these traditions. So you can go and take that and run with it and get to the point where you can say, well, Christmas is an evil thing because it came out of these. I will never go down that road. I believe that God judges the heart, and I believe that there are things that draw us closer to him that he loves, and there are things that draw us away from him that he despises, and there really is no middle ground. There aren't neutral things, and if you examine your life, you should be able to put everything you do into one of two buckets. Does this draw me closer to him or further away? And he said, there is no middle. You're either for me or you're against me. And I find everything about the Christmas holiday draws me closer to him. For 1 month of the year, I'm standing in Home Depot listening to people humming, O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel. Good theology. The rest of the year, they're insulting, laughing at, mocking my king. And for 1 month, they're singing songs that uplift him, that the way he's spoken of. And to me, I will never be able to embrace the fact that because we have kept imagery, that somehow pollutes what's going on in my heart during this time of year. So I've heard many, many, many sermons and read many books on how evil it is to celebrate with the trappings of Mystery Babylon and how that ties to Revelation, and I don't buy it. I don't believe God is mocked. I don't believe we fool him somehow, and he's like, I really like that you're worshiping me right now. I really like this is drawing close, but I can't accept it because you got one of those trees. It's just not the God that we serve, and I can't really get on board with those. So I don't go too far down that rabbit hole. It's just kind of worth noting that it's there, and you'll hear it every single year. You'll hear some pastor realizing the histories of this and getting kind of on a kick that we move away from this, or putting you under a guilt trip because of it. And I don't believe that's the way God operates. And I could be wrong, but it would surprise me and rock my theology in a lot of different ways. So, what does the Bible say? We don't have the luxury of doing topical Christianity, I don't believe. I believe on every subject, whether it's the birth of Christ, whether it's learning about prayer or baptism or getting to know him, we've got one resource that's meant to convey something that the Holy Spirit put together for a purpose to convey a truth. And I don't think you can just do a topical study of Christmas and use it to illustrate some truths, but not really dig into what's behind it. And so I really encourage you, not just in this class, but to spend some time, because there's no way to go into all of it. I'm going to skip over some of the attributes, like the story of John the Baptist and some of the side stories, and really focus on the Christ narrative. But just spending some time and doing an exegetical study, a verse by verse, not what's the heart of it, not what's the feeling of it, but what does it say and what does it mean? And so I'm going to do some of that. But to start off, I want to establish that the baby that was in the manger is Yeshua, who was the Messiah of Israel. His name is not Jesus Christ. It's not Lord Jesus Christ, first, middle, and last name. There were over 150 prophecies that specifically foretold the coming of this one birth, this individual. And you can, if you take the time to really read those prophecies and understand the specificity, I'm with Chuck Missler, who says you can be more certain of the fact that the baby that was in the manger at that time was the Messiah of Israel than you can be of any other fact in your command. More so than I can be that I am Brad Tubbs. I may not be. I might have had a head injury, and I may just be like a complete crack job who I don't know that statistically. There is nothing that points to that fact other than some records. I don't know that my mom is my mom. I could have been switched at birth in the hospital. All the things I could go through list after list. You take those things as truth because there's no other logical solution or because it's more likely than not. Statistically speaking, there is no fact more well established by both prophecy looking forward and history looking backwards than the fact that this individual that was born that day on that time is the Messiah that was prophesied of Israel. There is a really interesting book. I'm not going to get into the prophetic side of it because that's a whole study in itself, is nailing down who he is and how he fulfilled these prophecies. But there's a book by a guy named Peter Stoner, and it's called Science Speaks, where he literally goes through all 108 prophecies. This is in the 60s, and gives a statistical analysis using probabilities on what's the likelihood that one person would fulfill that prophecy, right? What's the likelihood that of 70 billion births, someone is born in Bethlehem? We can figure that out, right? We know how many people are born. You can figure that out. So you give that a value. How many people, just going through these and just using the 8 probably most well-known Christmas prophecies, he does a statistical analysis that gives you a 1 in 10 to the 26th power likelihood. That's beyond statistical absurdity to say that it is not fact. That is the same. You have the odds of it happening twice, of 2 people fitting the mold for all 8 of those prophecies, keeping in mind that there's 108 specific to the birth of Christ. Just these 8, the odds of 2 people filling that is the same as winning the lottery every day for 226 days straight. You're beyond the point of statistical absurdity that one person could ever fill all of those in a single birth. And so impossible to make the case without really going into it. Lee Strobel does a really good job of summarizing it in more of a less dorky way than Stoner does. He actually goes through and kind of talks about the prophecies and what they mean and stuff. Really interesting, but I think you have to come into the study with the assumption that he is who he says he is, that he is who the Bible portrays him as. And if you're not at that point, then take a step back and really spend time in prophecy and see if you can convince yourself that it's possible that it was someone else. If you can, I'm more than interested to talk, but for the purpose of this study, I think it's beneficial just to work off the operating assumption that he is who he says he is and could be no one else. So that is where
I heard
I start.
A really neat one when I was researching that, the one in the quadrillion. If you took the state of Texas and you covered it 2 feet deep in silver dollars and marked one of them, took a man blindfolded, put him in the middle of it and said, you go anywhere you want, just pick one coin, the odds of him picking out one coin
are the same as 2 people being born and meeting all 8 of those, just those 8, not 108.
Just the 8.
That's straight out of Lee Strobel. That's Case for Christ, or Case for Christmas. He uses that exact, I don't know where he got it, but he uses that exact same analogy. Covers the state of Texas with quarters and 2 inches deep. But yeah, I mean, you're to the point of just mathematically absurd. And yet we're only talking about 8 prophecies of the 108 that point to him. And so it really is just, I'll beat a dead horse if I keep going on that point. And yeah, it's beyond an impossibility. So we move forward with the assumption that he is, if nothing else, the Messiah of Israel, the prophesied Messiah of Israel. We're not getting into whether he is God incarnate here in that just with the prophecies, they say he will be, but just to establish that he was that individual that was prophesied is beyond statistical likelihood to an absolute. And so what you do with the rest of the claims about him is spiritual. That, in my mind, is logical, right? There's a spiritual aspect to what are you going to do with him once you establish that he is the Messiah. I don't know how, just from a logical standpoint, you can deny it from prophecy. And that's kind of my bent in prophecy. But getting into the Christmas story in our slightly detached and academic way, while still trying to do it justice, I'm going to try to limit the notes a little bit, but still convey what I'm saying. So I'm going to read what is obviously incredibly familiar verses, and then we'll go back through and just think about some of the things they're saying. And we're not going to be able to pick apart all of it, but just some of the more blaring things that we might just skip right over in most of our readings. Now in the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent by God to a city in Galilee named Nazareth, to a virgin betrothed to a man whose name was Joseph, of the house of David. The virgin's name was Mary. And having come in, the angel said to her, "Rejoice, highly favored one, the Lord is with you. Blessed are you among women." But when she saw him, she was troubled at his saying and considered what manner of greeting this was. Then the angel said to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God. And behold, you will conceive in your womb and bring forth a son, and shall call his name Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Highest. And the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end." Then Mary said to the angel, "How can this be, since I do not know a man?" And the angel answered and said to her, "The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Highest will overshadow you. Therefore also that Holy One who is to be born will be called the Son of God. Now indeed Elizabeth, your relative, has also conceived a son in her old age, and this now the 6th month for her, who was called barren. For with God nothing is impossible." Then Mary said, "Behold, the maidservant of the Lord, let it be to me according to your word." And the angel departed from her. Very familiar passage, and the basis, Luke 1 is probably what's read in everyone's home on Christmas morning. Matthew has an account of the birth of Christ, but it's specific to Joseph. And John and Mark breeze right past it. John starts with the incarnation. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. Mark goes straight to his first miracle. So this is kind of the gist of what we know about the birth of Christ. One of the first things you'll notice is now in the 6th month, the angel Gabriel. We skip right over that. The 6th month of what? The 6th month of...
Elizabeth's pregnancy.
When the prophecy started, when Elizabeth became pregnant.
Yeah.
The 6th month of the Jewish calendar year. It's always, all through the Bible, it's spoken of each of the months. All the feasts are in the 3rd month, you shall, in the 4th month. And so there's a religious and a secular calendar in Judaism, and they are very specific. The Bible exclusively, after Noah, after Moses uses the religious calendar, as you might imagine. The 6th month is the month of Elul, and it is the equivalent of our mid-August, September time frame. And so in the 6th month, the angel comes to her. I don't know what gestation periods are back in those days, but in order to get a December baby, that would mean she was pregnant for less than 3 months. And so we see Hanukkah marked on here, and that's obviously correlates with December. 9 months gets us to the month of Sivan, which gets us into May, April time frame, which is more likely the birth. I don't find it to be a coincidence that that's also the time of Shavuot, meaning the gestation period would have started with the season of joy, the season of victory, the season of deliverance, and the season of the revelation. That's the progression of the Jewish calendar, and he would have been born during the period of the revelation. I think, again, Jews will tell you a Jew's catechism is its calendar. And so you can, meaning like a summary of your faith is their calendar. That's a common Jewish statement. Their calendar is very organized and has very significant meaning. I think this fits the narrative quite nicely. I also believe that he was probably born on or near Shavuot, the Feast of Shavuot. I would not be surprised if he was born on Shavuot came on Shavuot the first time and will come back again on Shavuot the second time. You start noticing these patterns. They're not absolute. They're nothing I would build doctrine on, but it just starts to have the fingerprint of the Spirit when these things start lining up just slightly too perfectly. The other part of it is we see in chapter 2, the shepherds were in the field keeping watch over their flocks by night. That is not something you do year round. Sheep are kept in a sheepfold year round, other than a few months during their birthing period. Then they would take them out into the field, commingle the sheep, allow them to be with the other sheep, but you had to watch them because that's when they were giving birth. And so that's where we find David. When his father goes to find him, he was sent out into the fields to tend the sheep. You didn't have to do that year round. Also, Israel gets ridiculous cold. You don't think of it as being high desert, but it's high desert, and you're not in the fields by night. They are in the sheepfolds during the winter. There's a limited period of time in which they are actually staying day and night out in the sheepfolds, and that's during when they are mating and giving birth. And so there's about a 3-month period, 2.5-month period when the shepherds are in the fields by night with the sheep. Otherwise, you are in your sheepfold because you can't live 24 hours a day. That's and Christ even uses the analogy of the sheepfold several times. It's a common thing in all of it. But that's when they would have been in the fields by night. Also happens to be around the April-May timeframe. The other thing is, we know that during this time, the Roman government declared a census for all the known world. If you know nothing about the Roman nation or the Roman Empire, you know that it's quite big, right? And it encompasses all of what's now Germany, Poland, Northern Europe. You do not declare a census in winter and have your people traveling on foot in winter unless you want them all to die, right? We're not talking about just the Middle East here. There was a census of the whole known world, and all records say that the census was every 5 years and started on the spring equinox. So everyone on the spring equinox, because it was a date that no matter where you were in the Roman Empire, you could set your calendar to it and know you have to go every 5 years to your hometown. That was the terminus quo, the thing that told you it's census time every 5 years. And so we know that. We know that happens around March, April. So around March, April, spring equinox, every 5 years, they would go to be counted. And that was a common practice. So everything biblically points to the birth of Christ sometime in May, April timeframe. And that lines up also with the Jewish calendar. The only thing, I can't tell you a date for certain. I can't tell you even within that specificity. Some people claim they can tell that they know the date exactly. The one thing I can tell you is the one time it could not have been is winter for about a dozen reasons. And so the tying it to December 25th is purely of convenience as we adopted some of the pagan traditions. So I think that's an easy one to put to bed. I don't know what relevance it is for your theology, but it's not a debate. It's kind of just, it is what it is. And we're not going to move this slow through the whole thing, but I'm kind of trying to just make a point that you can do this the entire way through. The angel Gabriel was sent by God to a city in Galilee named Nazareth, to a virgin betrothed to a man whose name was Joseph of the house of David. Why was it important? Why was the virgin birth important? Do we ever really stop and step back and say, okay, why does that matter? Other than it being unique, other than it being an indicator or a signpost, from a biblical standpoint, does it matter that it had to be? And the answer is, Scott's nodding his head, it absolutely did.
Isaiah 7:14.
Prophetically speaking, it was to be born of a virgin. We know that in the garden, God said that the seed of the woman would be the Savior. I'm not a doctor by any means, but I know that there is no such thing as the seed of a woman. That's not what they bring to the table. There is one seed of the woman, and it was singular and specific, and it was an indication of the virgin birth. But also, there is a genealogical problem that narrowed the field so that anybody else who claims to have had a virgin birth, has to meet really specific criteria in order to avoid a pitfall within the genealogical record. And that is why in both Matthew and in Luke, the genealogy of Christ is given. It's important for the record because there were qualifications. There are ways so this guy meets the standard, and it's incredibly specific. In Matthew, we see that the genealogy starting at Abraham. It's a Jewish record and goes all the way to Joseph. And similarly, Luke's starts at Jacob and goes to Joseph. But one of the things you notice right away is in Matthew's genealogy, and Jacob begot Joseph, the husband of Mary. Yet in Luke's genealogy, you see being, now Jesus himself began his ministry of about 30 years of age, being, as was supposed, the son of Joseph, the son of Heli. So Joseph was the son of Heli and the son of Jacob as well. There seems to be a contradiction that people will point to as contradicting themselves. But what you miss is Luke's genealogy is a genealogy of Mary, not of Joseph. And there is an exception in the Torah that makes Christ's lineage possible. And we'll get to that in a second. But just going through Matthew's genealogy, you can tell the story of the Old Testament almost through and through just by using this genealogy. It starts with Judah. Judah is obviously, we know, is the kingly line. So Judah has to be in his genealogy somewhere. We remember the story of the sordid story of Judah sleeping with his daughter-in-law and giving birth to Perez, and that weird thing that happened. And then Perez, which was a stain on the family and a bastard can't enter the congregation, to the seventh generation. Well, who's the seventh generation from Perez? David. So David becomes the seventh generation out of Perez. It becomes a prophetic type, even that sordid tale. We notice a couple other names. Salmon. Salmon begot Boaz by Rahab. Rahab, the harlot, out of Jericho. And Boaz, her son, becomes the hero in the book of Ruth, who marries Ruth and then becomes in the line of Christ. So we have the harlot of Jericho giving birth to, who was a Gentile, giving birth to Boaz, who becomes the kinsman redeemer. And so because she was a Gentile, he is able to take Ruth as a bride, who Ruth was a Gentile. And you start seeing, I'm not making a case out of this, but these genealogies are incredible because it weaves what I call the scarlet thread, this line from Eve's finger to Mary's finger of a story of redemption that starts with the fall and ends with the virgin birth. And it's all through, and you can trace it through the genealogy, and it's very intentional. Jesse, being the father of David, begot David the king. Every genealogy goes through David. But then we see that David begot Solomon. And Solomon, as everyone knows, is the kingly line. David's son Solomon takes the throne. But we run into this problem because in the kingly line, after the divided kingdom, Josiah begot Jeconiah. And Jeconiah was bad news. Won't go into all but he enforced idolatry, and because of all his evil in Jeremiah 22, the Lord through Jeremiah says, "Not one of the remnant of your seed will sit on the throne. I have cut you out, I have cursed you." So God places a blood curse on the kingly line of Jeconiah, and says no one from Jeconiah's line will ever sit on the throne. And I imagine Satan's going, "Oh man, you hosed yourself," right? Because he's established the genealogy of Christ that has to come through David and has to come through the kingly line because of prophecy. And so David's goes all the way down and then hits Jeconiah, and God pronounces a blood curse. So God's got himself a problem, right? How do you bring about the Messiah through the kingly line? it has to go through your father. There's only one route, except there's one exception. And we see that Joseph, the son of Heli, you trace Heli's genealogy all the way back. He goes through David's third son, Nathan. So Heli is able to trace not to the kingly line, but to David. So David's promise is fulfilled. But how does that get Joseph and Jesus in the line of succession of the kingly line? There's an exception in the Torah from Numbers 22 called the daughters of Zelophehad. And when they were parting out the land, they were saying all males of the tribes are allotted land. 3 daughters, the daughters of Zelophehad, came and said, my father has no sons. What shall be in our inheritance? And Moses goes to God, and God says, make an exception. And God and Moses go back and forth, and you see them negotiating, and says, make an exception for them so that they can be in the inheritance, so that their husband would be, once they are married, their husband is deemed adopted by their father, so the husband becomes in the line of succession. So by marrying Mary, Joseph becomes in the kingly line, passes the blood curse of Jeconiah, and makes his son the legal heir and of the kingly line. There is literally one tree that works down to where someone could be of the kingly line and of the legal line to be of the house of Judah. And it is through this weird exception in Numbers 22 that's made seemingly in connection with a land allocation. But yet they rely on it and calling Heli, or Joseph, the son of Heli, because Heli only had daughters. And so Joseph is then adopted by Mosaic law, and Christ is in the lineage through Mary, not Joseph, and traces back to David, and therefore he's eligible to sit on the throne without the blood curse of Jeconiah. That is mind-blowing.
So like Heli married
Heli's Joseph's father-in-law. Heli would be Mary's father.
Oh, okay.
Yep, Heli is Mary's father. Heli only has sons, or only has daughters. So he has no one to inherit. But then when Mary marries Joseph, Joseph becomes a legal son of Heli, right? And you notice it doesn't say Heli begot Joseph. It says Josiah begot, or I'm sorry, it says Jacob begot Joseph. Heli didn't beget him, but he became Bar Adat Heli, the son of Heli.
That's why, must be why Luke does the genealogy differently.
Backwards.
Yeah, it's backwards.
Yep.
It's backwards from the normal Jewish way of doing
Exactly. That's exactly the point. Is he inverts it and goes through Mary and says, so that's why they're backwards. It's not the Jewish tradition to go from the youngest. You establish your patronage. You establish your patronage here. This is the one genealogy where we're going to call it the matronage matters. And it's only because of this exception that was in the book of Numbers that allowed him to be adopted into the line. And that's like, in my mind, if you need more proof, you just narrowed the entire field of Judaism from Moses to today down. There is no one else that could fit that, could be in the line of David, but not in the line of Jeconiah, who has the blood curse. You narrowed it down to literally one stream that you could possibly find the Messiah, and he happens to be on it. Go figure. So, like I said, won't go through the painful detail, that much detail with all of this, but just to give you an idea, we're in verse 1 of this story, or 2 of this story, and you can see that it's being crafted. You can see that there's more here than just a cute Sunday school story. The part I'm going to really highlight here, well, remember, every time we encounter a name, whether it sounds Greek or sounds Hebrew, be disciplined and understand what it means, because in Hebrew they're significant. Joseph, we know what Joseph means because it tells the name of Joseph when Joseph is born to Jacob. It says, God has added to me, has given me an addition, given me an extra. I think it's hilarious that Joseph is named an extra. Like in this story, he is not needed, he is an extra. Right? And his name literally means an addition. Miriam, Mary, is the Greek version. Miriam is the Hebrew, and it means the exalted one. And that is exactly what it goes on to say about her.
Joseph's the plus one.
Joseph's the plus one. He's just added to the thing. I think that's so funny to me. I think that's like, you tell me the Holy Spirit doesn't have humor. Name the guy an addition, an extra. So this is, keep moving through here. I've got highlighted in red here some of the attributes of Mary, and I only have them highlighted because the next thing we're going to go to is the Magnificat of Mary, and that's one of, in my mind, the most incredible things in the Bible. And you see the way Mary is spoken of. Rejoice, highly favored one. The Lord is with you. Blessed are you among women, for you have found favor with God. And her response to all of this, her response to, in a culture where you're probably going to be stoned for infidelity, in a culture where she knows that she'll be shunned for the rest of her life, she's not a fool. She knows the implications of this, that no one's going to believe her. Her response immediately is, behold, the maidservant of the Lord, let it be to me according to your word. Not a bit. Like that mark of character, if there was nothing else, if there wasn't chapter 2, that would still make her stand out among all Bible characters in my mind, other than Daniel. Daniel, and he's about the only other one that you can see that kind of response in. But keep moving through. Behold, you will conceive in your womb and bring forth a son, and you shall call his name Jesus. We lose the significance of that. His name was not Jesus. Jesus is a Greek transliteration of a name, and it has no meaning. When we get into Matthew's, when the angel is speaking to Joseph, says, your wife, she will bring forth a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he shall save his people from their sins. What does that mean? Jesus, for he shall save his people. Sweet. Like, Jesus means nothing. That's just a name, right? That's just it's not explaining anything. His name was Yeshua, which is Yahshua. Jehovah is salvation. You shall name him Jehovah is salvation, for he shall save his people from their sins. That actually makes sense when you use the proper name, when you understand the meaning, and they understood the meaning. Names were not arbitrary. Like, Jesus is just a label. Yeshua is a sentence, or is a saying. Jehovah is salvation. You shall call him Jehovah is salvation, for he shall save his people from their sins. Taking the, and that's why I think it's important to me, to one of the things the ESV, that translation of the Bible, one of the few things I think it did really well is it took away all of the Christ out of the New Testament and called him the Messiah. So it was, still use Jesus, but Jesus the Messiah, because Christ is just Christos, the Greek for Messiah. And so knowing it's not just his last name, it's a title, and his name is significant. Jehovah is salvation, and he is the Mashiach Nagid, the Messiah, the King. And it's a very specific fulfillment that we miss as Christians. And then here's the big part of all this. He will be great and be called the Son of the Highest, and the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever. Has that happened? Where was the throne of David even in existence when he was born? Rome was ruling. There was a tyrant, a Rome-appointed magistrate on the throne. There has not been a throne of David since he was born. So either this is yet to be fulfilled, or God is not going to fulfill that, and in which case you run the risk of making God a liar. And that's kind of what we went into in great detail on some of the Israel study and the role of Israel, and so I won't beat that to death. But this is a yet future promise that God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom. These are separate things. It's not one and the same. He's going to have his kingdom. He's going to rule over the house of David. Those are keeping them separate, as we've done in the past. And then just one warning note that comes at the end of this. This is the angel speaking to Mary, says, the Holy Spirit will come on you, and the power of the highest will overshadow you. Therefore, also, that Holy One who is to be born will be called the Son of God. From that also is the entire doctrine of the Catholic Church of the deification of Mary. It's saying they take it as God shall come upon her and shall manifest through her and also her offspring. That they take those as two divine incarnations, and that's the basis for the deification of Mary, is that also. The Hebrew and the Greek both agree to say yet more, not also, but yet more he shall. Like, he shall come upon you and give you a child, yet more he shall be called. He shall incarnate this child. It was not that Mary was becoming some sort of an incarnation of God. She was an honored vessel to carry the Son of the living God, but she did not become God. He became God. And so keeping those two doctrines separate, but really that also is the basis of the deification of Mary doctrine, and it all springs out of that.
Mary was the conduit, and Yeshua was the vessel.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. Absolutely. He indwelt in Jesus, not in Mary, and that's kind of the convoluted nature of that. Following this, Mary goes in to visit her cousin Elizabeth, who is also with child, and there's obviously the story of John the Baptist that precedes this, and also is part of the Mary's story. But right in the midst of it, Mary goes to visit Elizabeth, and randomly, this kid just breaks out into worship. The most important thing to note is she was probably 13, 14, or 15 years old. Right? That's the marrying age for that time. She would have been a spinster after that, if not betrothed and married away. So 13, 14, or 15th, no theological training, no reading, writing, or any form of formal education. Boys were not educated other than their trade, except for the Torah. Boys went to school to learn the Torah and then learn their trade from their father. Women learned one trade, and it was household maintenance, and it was very linear. It was not reading, writing. It's not what you see on what's the Chosen. They weren't. That was not a. That's an embellishment to try to make it a little more palatable. Women did not receive education. So when you read the prayer of this 13, 14, or 15-year-old uneducated girl, it is mind-blowing, and you start to see the kind of character why it is not a random selection that God chose her to be most honored among all who would ever live. Right? The Magnificat of Mary is probably, in my mind, the most revealing prayer of a heart, and shows me with no question why she was chosen among all the women who ever lived. And so it's not theological to where I don't want to pick it apart. I put it in here because I would really encourage you to read it 5 times before going to bed, and just read it as a prayer, read it as, and
Where's
just,
it at, though?
what's that?
Where's it at?
It's in Matthew or Luke 1:26 or 46. Yeah, and it's set out. I mean, it's just incredible. Her heart is revealed, but not just her heart. That she had knowledge of the expectation of the Messiah that exceeds even what the scribes and the Pharisees exhibit later on. They're missing things that this 15-year-old girl understood, and her heart just. It's called the Magnificat of Mary because it starts off, "My heart magnifies you." And that's like, you listen to the way I pray, I am an absolute buffoon. Like, I try to pray out loud, and I sound like a Neanderthal, and I'm like fumbling through my words, and you've got this connection with God that just, her heart calls out. And I love it for that, because there's no question in my mind why God chose her to honor among all people. So I am going to pass that over and just ask that you spend some time on that tonight and just read through it as many times as it takes to absolutely blow you away. But here, I'm going to focus, not get weepy. We get back to the story, the meat of what we all are comfortable with. And it came to pass in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world will be registered. The census first took place while Quirinius was governing Syria, so all went to be registered, everyone to his own city. Joseph also went up to Galilee, out of the city of Nazareth into Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed wife, who was with child. So it was that while they were there, the days were completed for her to be delivered, and she brought forth her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. This was an interesting validation of the Bible. For a long time, this idea that Quirinius was the governor of Syria was mocked, and until the 1900s, that they found the Roman records of Herod Archelaus being essentially sent into exile, and this warlord, Quirinius, who was making on a campaign in the Syrian area, was pulled off of campaign to be the governor for about a 5-year stretch over this area. And that is the fingerprints of the Holy Spirit. We have now a historical record that narrows this entire thing down to 5 years. There's a 5-year period that we can validate historically that this happened, and it's through that discovery. And I just think it's another one of those that's interesting, because for years and years and years, that was like a point of contention. Well, that never happened. So point that out for only academic reasons. And all went to be registered. This is kind of what I got to before. This is not a local thing. This isn't an in Israel thing. This was a Roman thing that happened every 5 years. And if we're assuming a winter time for the birth of Christ, you have people in northern Germany traveling to their hometowns in winter on foot. They are all dead. There's no surviving that trek. That's what Napoleon learned going into Russia. That's what Hitler learned going into Russia. You do not make that trek on foot and survive, no matter how well apportioned you are. So this did not happen during the time frame that we put it. And again, all the world. This idea of there was no room for them in the inn is very quaint and very adopted in all our literature and all our imagery. It's really interesting to me because the idea of the katuma is the upper room of a house. And so we use that term over and over and over. It's used 14 different times in the New Testament, and it's always in the upper room. When Christ sends them to prepare a place in the upper room, it's in the katuma, the guest house, the guest room. And so, what the common the common structure of a home was 3 floors. The lower floor, if you were wealthy, you had a kitchen dining thing and you had stables outside. If you were not wealthy, the animals were on the lower floor. The middle floor was called the upper room, and that was your living area. That's where dining, beds, bedrolls, and everything. And then the roof was your working area, was where the cooking, the grinding, the flour. I mean, it's temperate area. The roof was kind of a working area. So the upper room is like your living quarters. So what it's saying here is they were put on the bottom floor because there was no room in the upper floor of where they were staying. And that's why they're down with the animals. It's not the idea of going house to house to house. That's countercultural. The reason he's going to Bethlehem in the first place is because that's his line. He's going to his family. They knew every member of their family. They knew them generations and generations back. They knew them cousins of cousins of cousins of cousins. It is a point of pride to know every bit of your ancestry. He was going back to his ancestry, and there is no concept of, well, I'm a visitor. That's your ancestry. He would have known everyone that he could have stayed with, and this was the way traveling was done. And so he would have gone and found some of his ancestors.
And he'd probably been there 5 years before that.
Absolutely. They're traveling. Yep. We know that, yeah, exactly. We know that actually this is the second one. The first, this is totally off track, but the first time they went to take a census was what tipped off the Maccabean revolt 5 years ago. The Bar Kokhba revolt that started Hanukkah was because the Romans tried to do a census, and the Jews are not allowed to be counted. According to the law, you can't count you can't number the people, and that started the Bar Kokhba revolt, which was the Maccabees and Hanukkah. was all of this was driven out of the last time they tried to do a census. So the Romans actually made a disposition for the nation of Israel to where when they counted them, they would say not one, not two, not three, not four. So they weren't numbering the people, which was against the Torah. And that's what allowed them not to, that's why they didn't revolt this time. It's a really weird historical thing, but Josephus and Herodotus both attest to the fact that they made an accommodation to try to avoid another revolt after the last census. So yeah, he was there 5 years ago, probably did the same thing, but also they just knew their genealogy better than they knew anything else and knew their families, and it's a very important familial culture.
So what, they said laid him in a manger, so what?
Oh,
Manger?
a feeding trough, but in the base of the house was, if you weren't wealthy, the bottom layer of your house was your stables, right? Well, that's where the animals all stayed. The middle layer was your living quarters. The top layer was your working, cooking, whatever your livelihood, drying your nets, whatever on top of the house. But that middle was like living. So it's saying there's no room in the living quarters, so they put them downstairs with the animals. So probably had tons of family in town. And
in New England, they still have some really old homes that are built like upside down boats. I mean, they're a rounded thing in the upper, and they're the lower part, which most of them have been remodeled into living space, but it was their animal place. It was directly underneath where they lived.
almost every, Scottish, like in England, same thing, old stone buildings, the basement would be, because you only had the money to warm one building. But that's the common architecture. You can still even see it in Israel today.
So for them in the inn, where they get the name in the inn?
I have no idea.
The upper room
It's
or
the
upper-
only place that ketupah is translated in, because we have a Western idea of traveling, right? But you see it used 11 different times, 14 different times in total, and each time they call it the upper room. And it's part of Jewish architecture. It's not even the top, it's the middle, it's the upper room where you live and eat and sleep.
So this is our family's home.
Not necessarily. I mean, it could have been distant relative, but yeah, exactly. This is someone's home. Yeah.
You would have knocked on the door, hey, I'm Joseph.
And there would have
son of so-and-so."
exactly son of, back to Adam
They probably
and known it.
known him anyway.
Exactly.
Because that's not a very good place.
It's
even today. It's not a very
that's absolutely right. And only people right now in Bethlehem are of the tribe of David. Everyone else had to go to where their tribe's from. So if you lived in Bethlehem and you were of another tribe, you left. The only people left in town are his lineage. And I mean, like, you see go to like a Latin American culture and experience how like proud of lineage and knowledgeable about parents. They don't travel and not stay with family and stuff like this. Is that times 100. Like they're yeah, there we go. Is that right? I mean, like, do you like seeing family and stuff? That like historically, is that a fair statement? It's valued much more than it is here.
Well, I mean, I can only speak for the Philippines, but like families, whenever they marry, they just build on
Build and
everybody lives together in the same home.
And
So,
that's most of the cultures. We just don't have this idea of it. We think of travelers. They're not really travelers in that sense. They're kind of like, this would be like going home,
We had such a huge wilderness area that people
just dispersed. Yep, and that's no other culture they've historically stayed put, and so they've built familial units. But this is like, Jews took that pride to a level that no other culture has ever done. Their entire identity was based on, I'm a son of Abraham, and I can list everyone in my line to Abraham up till 70 AD when the diaspora happened. So the idea that he would just be wandering into town, into the city of David, when he's of the tribe of David, and going knocking door to door, at hotels. Is there any open rooms in these stone hotels?
When you talking about in Revelation, when you're talking about the bride, that when the woman marries the man, she goes to his house anyway?
Exactly. So part of the
So
ceremony.
when he's preparing a place, they're just adding a room onto the house?
Yep, that's why there's a waiting period, is he would start building something, a place for them to live on the parents' houses. I go to prepare a place, when Christ says, I go to prepare a place for you. That's a common part of the wedding ceremony. The groom would leave the bride for a period of time while he makes a place for them to live, usually just stacking it on the side of mom and dad's house, and they just keep boom, boom, boom. And so that's the culture. And so the idea of them being wanderers that came into town and knew no one and were by themselves and is first of all absurd, because they're just packed in with people no matter what, right? We know there's no room. So one way or the other, there's probably people sleeping in every corner. They had to put their baby in a manger. You got to imagine there's 50 other people in this room sleeping in cots on the ground, like packed around them. This is not like a silent night. That's kind of, this was chaos. And that's part of another thing I kind of get into later here. So Luke 2, because of time, I'm going to just truncate this a little bit, because I don't really have a ton to add. After the birth in Bethlehem, the next thing we see is an angel visiting the shepherds in the field by night. The shepherds are in the field by night and receive a visitation of an angel who announces the birth of Christ to shepherds. And the shepherds understand, and the angel tells them, go into town, go into Bethlehem, and you will find, as a sign, a baby wrapped in swaddling clothes and laying in a feeding trough. And so they know what they're looking for. They take that, they go back, and they find exactly what the angel said they would find. And so rejoicing, they tell everyone, right? The whole tribe of David, or the whole tribe of the lineage of David, so probably Lion of Judah, is in Bethlehem. All of these are family, ancestry, and these people that they know and are probably related to, because even the shepherds had to go to their hometowns. They're telling what they saw, and they're saying, hey, and that baby that's 3 streets down, I just saw an angel who said that's God, right? This is a big deal. These are close-knit communities, and these are people they know who received a visitation from an angel that was confirmed by finding a baby. And then it says that they went and told everyone, and that the whole town was in an uproar, right? They knew what was going on. They believed the Messiah had been born. This was a big deal. One of the questions that I've never found an answer to is, why shepherds? Why did the angel come to shepherds first? And there's nothing in the Bible that says it. There's gobs and gobs and gobs of speculation that, well, it was an analogy to the Lamb of God, that David was a shepherd, that all these things, and they may all be completely true. You can kind of go down that rabbit hole. The closest I've ever come to it is they were watching. They were the ones still watching. When Christ comes the second time, the whole way through, we're advocated to be watching. Watch for me. Watch for me, I'm coming. Be waking. There's parables of the bride who wasn't ready, of Christ in his first coming was announced to the ones who are watching. In his second coming, he will first come to the ones who are watching. That's the only one to me that from a structural biblical makes sense on why them, just that they happen to be the one watching, and it fits the prophetic mold of his second coming. Is he'll come first to the ones who are watching. Be vigilant, be ready, be wakeful. I think there's...
Is the star true? So if they were watching, would they have seen the star in the sky and then known that something was happening?
So the star doesn't happen until years later.
Yeah,
With the 3 kings.
at least
Yep.
a couple of years.
So right now, notice it says, you will find a baby laying in a manger. You will find a babe, an infant, a child wrapped in swaddling clothes laying in the manger, right? And it says the same thing, that they wrapped him. This is when the shepherds hear of this, they go to find a baby. When the star leads the wise men, which we're going to get into, it says they go and found the child. And the child is the adolescent in the Hebrew. It's a middling child. They go and find the child, and they worshipped it, and it says it 3 different times, worshipped at the feet of the child. So it's years later before that visitation happens. There was no magi coming to the manger and giving gifts while he was a baby. And it's a huge journey. First of all, we're going to talk about that. Hundreds of miles. And there's a basis for it, but it didn't just happen on one night. It happened years later, and that's a giant part of what we're getting into. In fact, what's that?
What do I do with my
just keep the wise men on the other side of the lawn. Yeah, just put them.
Put them on the other side of the room.
That's what exactly. That's what I said too. Yeah, keep them across the lawn.
I've seen people do that.
Yep.
Have the manger and then the wise men are on the other side of the room.
So this is all of what we just went through is what I will say the common narrative of it. Then there's the less common part that we don't really, I mean, everyone's familiar with this. Everyone's read the story of Herod. Everyone's read the story of the wise men. But I bet most people have heard that first part, Luke 1, Luke 1 and 2, so many times that you can almost recite it. You don't often tell the story of Herod killing the babies, right? That's not something you say by the tree in the morning. It is a treasure trove when you shift from Luke to Matthew. So now Luke's narrative ends and goes on to Jesus' childhood and his circumcision. Matthew's narrative picks up after the birth and just launches into in Matthew 2. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who was born King of the Jews? We have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him." When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. So they said to him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet, but you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you shall come a ruler who shall shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod, when he had secretly called the wise men, determined from them what time the star had appeared, and then to them, the Bethlehem, he said, "Go and search carefully for a young child, and when you have found him, bring back word to me, that I may come and worship him also." When they heard the king, they departed, and behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them, till it came and stood over the place where the young child was. So this is what Kelly, you were just asking. The star appeared to them in the east, and now, as they've come, it says it moved to go over the place.
Yeah.
Right, so it took them from where they are. And that is the star. There is no other reference in the Bible, prophetically or otherwise, to the Bethlehem star. I can tell you it's not in there. People will make twisted things that it was prophesied that there would be a star. I very fervently believe this is nothing else but the Shekinah presence of God, that God had indwelt the earth again, and once again was leading by fire. Like the Shekinah presence led the Israelites through the wilderness as a pillar of fire by night and a cloud by day. It was in the temple and the tabernacle as a great light in the Holy of Holies. When the Shekinah presence passes by Moses, it was as if a great light that left him glowing. It is the presence of God, the Holy Spirit, on earth, incarnate. It is always visualized as a light. When Jeconiah defiles the temple, we see the Shekinah leaving through the west gate, leaving through the temple, and actually departing Jerusalem through the west gate as a great light. And so I believe, and there is nothing to substantiate this other than consistency in the text, that they were led to the place of God by the Shekinah presence. The Holy Spirit, the Shekinah presence, led them to the place of birth. And so there is no...
So not a star.
A star is the word that is a burning light. It could be a comet. It could be
I've seen it called a great light.
a great light. Yep, it's in one of the translations. It's just called a great light in the heavens, and so because it's just a burning light is the word they use, and they didn't even know that stars were burning at that time.
So did Joseph and Mary stay in Bethlehem, or they just went there for the census and then went back?
They were in Bethlehem, and the angel came to Joseph and said, Herod's coming, he wants you, he's going to kill the babies, go to Egypt.
Yeah, I don't know why they stayed in Bethlehem so long, but they apparently did, and it was by divine providence, because that also got them out of the country quicker than...
Joseph's trade, he could practice it anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So why not, after, you got this new baby.
You got a newborn.
You want to pack up your wife with a brand new baby and hoof it back to Nazareth.
When he had family.
Yep, so that's why, exactly. And so if they're staying at an inn, this doesn't make sense. If they're staying with their family, now you see them at least 2 years later, probably 2 years later, still living there, the child's
Magi, it says, went to the house.
to the house, exactly, where the child was. That's exactly right. So,
In Bethlehem.
in Bethlehem. So they
Probably
stayed.
weaned child.
I think so. The Hebrew, the Greek actually is very specific and indicates that it's like a adolescent child. 2 to 5 is the range that they would say. Pre-adolescent, I mean, yeah.
So
So-
after the wise men, they went to Egypt.
So yep, the wise men leave, and then he's raised until whatever age in Egypt. But it's very clear that we've got a period of time between the birth and the appearance of the Magi, right? Then being divinely warned in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed for their own country another way. So 2 big figures that play in here. And because it's Christmas, and I know how much everybody loves Christmas, a history lesson, I will give a Christmas history lesson. If you ever wonder why Herod built the temple or rebuilt Zerubbabel's temple in about 100 BC, and then we still see Herod on the throne in about 90 AD when Paul goes to meet with him, it's because there are about 5 Herods in the Bible. They're just all called Herod. Herod the Great was the builder of the temple. That's the father. He has 3 sons. Herod Archelaus is the first to take the throne when Herod the Great dies. He goes up until right about 1 BC era, 4 BC. And then Herod Philip, or Herod the Tetrarch, is the one who takes over after him, kills him, takes over, and Herod the Tetrarch is the one that's alive during the whole life of Christ. And then after Herod the Tetrarch is Herod Agrippa, who's the one that is there's Herod Agrippa the first, and then Herod Agrippa's son, Herod Agrippa the second, also called Herod Antipas or Antipater. And he is the one that that questions Paul. And so there are several Herods in the Bible. It's not one dude that lived for 250 years, because you keep seeing him getting banished and then still Herod's on the throne. They make the joke that it's a hereditary dynasty, but that's pretty weak. He was not Jewish. That's the most important thing to note. It's Herod the Idumean, or the Edomite. So Edom, if you remember, if you're back in your Old Testament, is the historical enemy of Israel. Edomites are the one they're doing battle with the entire time, especially through Judges, through the formation of the nation. The Edomites are their loathed enemies. After the Bar Kokhba revolt, Rome is fed up with Israel. They appoint an Edomite ruler over them as a slap in the face. They put Herod as the king of Israel because it would be the ultimate insult to put an Idumean over Jerusalem. And then they rename the place Palestine, which is after the Philistines. It is Philistina. So they name the place their bitter enemies to the south, and then they put their bitter enemies to the north in charge of them because they cannot stand the Jews after the Bar Kokhba revolt. And so all of this is Rome despised the Jews, and they sat in that condition for about 100 years until 70 AD when the emperor says, you will never be able to rule Jerusalem as long as a Jew is alive in Jerusalem. And so then Titus Vespasian wipes out the Jews, and the diaspora starts. But the whole idea of this being ancient Palestine is a Roman construct in order to insult the Jews, and the idea of Herod being the dynastic ruler over them was another backhanded insult of the Jews that was very intentional. The Romans hated the Jews. And so the figure of Herod is despised by all of Israel because he's an outsider. He is not a Jew. And so it kind of starts making a little more sense when these people come from outside, and the first thing they ask is, where is he that was born king of the Jews? That is a straight insult to Herod. You are not the king. You are not born king of the Jews. You are an appointed official. Where is the real king? Who comes before a king and tells him, I'm looking for the real king? First of all, keep in mind that they used to say it was safer to be Herod's pigs than it is to be his sons. Herod would kill off all his sons because he was terrified of someone taking his throne, and he'd kill them for the most random reasons, probably 15 of them. he killed because he was worried about them taking over. He was very jealous of his power. And yet you've got, in our cultural narrative, 3 kings or 3 wise men walking into the palace of a despot king, someone with absolute authority in the area, who's killing off his sons because he's paranoid of his power, saying, hey, where's the real king? And he lets them live. Does that make sense to anybody?
That's because he wants to find who this real king is in the story.
I don't think he wants it that bad. I think there's a lot more to the story. The part that we miss is, at that time, Jerusalem is a buffer state. Parthian Empire to the east and the Roman Empire to the west. The wars between the Parthian Empire and the Roman Empire are legendary. That was the one place the Roman Empire could not conquer. It's the Persian Empire sort of faded, and the Parthian Empire rose in the Persian Empire. And so it's a rebirth of the same Persian Empire. But Mark Antony, Diasminus, all have famous battles in the Jerusalem region against the Parthian Empire. Each time the Romans lose and are rebuffed. They have constantly been in this state of war with them for about 200 years, and Jerusalem becomes this buffer state between the Parthian Empire, let's call it the Persian Empire on their east, and the Roman Empire on their west. And that has a political tension where this neutral ground that's been fought over historically all this entire 500-year period, that changes hands several times. And right now, Rome's holding it. Herod's been placed on top of it. But these were not 3 kings or 3 wise men. They were 3 magi. The word magi is a very specific word. It's the root word we get for magician, right? Someone who they were the wise men of the day. They were astrologers. They were dream interpreters. And it's a class, a hereditary priesthood in Persia. The Magi were a hereditary priesthood that went back thousands of years, all the way back to Babylon, to Nimrod. They could trace their lineage all the way back.
So I do want to clarify, there's nowhere in the scriptures that say that there were 3 magi, only that there were 3 people.
That's exactly right. The only place we get this idea of 3 of them is 3 gifts. There is no chance 3 individuals, and when I say no chance, I mean no chance, that 3 individuals walked into Herod's court by themselves and said, hey, where's the real king?
It was an army.
And walked out with their head. It was a Parthian army and probably hundreds of these cast of people called the Magi. Their other role, they were both priests and the king. They were called the kingmakers, which is where we get the term magistrate. Is they were heads of the government and they elected the king of the Parthian Empire. So I believe they had been told a king has been born, and they were going to find out who this king is to see whether there was an alliance to be made. They are the kingmakers in the Parthian Empire, and they are a very powerful class of people, right? And so all throughout uses this term magi, and we translate it wise men or soothsayer or whatever. But so you start to wonder, why are Persian priests seeking a Jewish king in Israel?
Because of Daniel.
Hey, all right. Good. And why are they coming giving prophetic gifts that have Jewish significance? So these guys show up with very specific gifts. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh are not random. Gold is the Jewish symbol of royalty. Frankincense is the priesthood. It's the what they would burn before the altar of God. It's what they would wear for perfume in the priesthood. It's the symbol of priesthood. And myrrh is embalming fluid. It's a spice that you would wrap the dead in. So his whole mission is prophesied in the 3 gifts that they got: the king, a priest, and dying. When we see Christ in the kingdom, when he comes back, it says the people will come and visit him, and they will bring him 2 gifts. They will bring him gold and frankincense. There will be no more myrrh. There's no more death, but he will still be a king and a priest. Those have significance. So why are Persian kingmakers, why are Persian priests traveling to go find a Jewish king in a buffer state and carrying with them Jewishly prophetic gifts? I believe the answer is in Daniel. The story of Daniel is remarkable. Daniel is a young man by the time Babylonians take over the southern kingdom, and he goes into the court of Nebuchadnezzar, who's the king of the world at the time. And because of interpreting dreams and God's protection, he rises in the court of Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful man alive, and actually becomes friends with Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is the only Gentile to write a chapter of the Bible in which he praises the God of Daniel. And Nebuchadnezzar, before he dies, says, "The king has answered unto Daniel and said, Of a truth it is that your God is a God of gods." This is the king of the world writing. "And a Lord of kings and a revealer of secrets, seeing thou could reveal this secret. Then the king made Daniel a great man. He gave him many great gifts and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon." That term wise men is the same term we're using. It's Magian in the Hebrew. So he's Rab Magian, the head of the Magi under Nebuchadnezzar's court. Daniel is not done. He outlives Nebuchadnezzar, and we see Belteshazzar, which is his grandson, and the handwriting on the wall, and Cyrus, the king of Persia, takes over Babylon. When Cyrus takes over Babylon without a battle, an old Jew is standing there with a scroll of Isaiah that names Cyrus by name and says, "Set my people go." One of the most extraordinary stories in the Bible, and so that is why we see Daniel immediately rise to power within the Persian Empire, because he went to the ruler of the world at that time and showed him his name 4 times written in the scrolls of Isaiah. And 200 years before he was born, "I have called you Cyrus. I have surnamed you, yet you have not known me, and I have still named you Cyrus." Can you imagine standing there reading that and having this dude just show you an old scroll with your name that you would be conquering in the name of his God?
So in Isaiah,
in Isaiah prophesies that God would use this person, Cyrus, as a vessel to conquer for him. And he surnames him and calls him by name 3 times. And then Daniel, after the Persians conquer, is standing there when Cyrus enters with the scroll of Isaiah and says, "This was prophesied. You are a servant of the living God. Let my people go." And that's why the Persians gave Zerubbabel and the Jews money and all sorts of incentives to go and rebuild the temple. He just set them free and let them go back and start rebuilding the temple out of the Persian Empire because they were so impressed with this prophecy. And that's the whole story of the rebuilding and the restoration of the nation.
I wrote about my blog during the several when I wrote about truth. One of them I wrote about that. There's about
so how does
7
doesn't Cyrus have to do with the guy with the donkey?
No, different. This is Cyrus. This is the Persian. Cyrus the Persian, the Medes and the Persians that conquered Babylon. So I'm sure there's several of that. But okay, so when the incident with Belshazzar, when the king's wife, when Nebuchadnezzar's wife, the old grandma who's still living in the palace, they can't figure out what the writing on the wall is. Grandma comes in and says, "Hey, there was a guy who had knowledge who worked for your grandfather Nebuchadnezzar." And your grandfather says, "Whom the king Nebuchadnezzar, thy father the king, I say, thy father, has made master of the magicians, the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers." So at this time, Daniel is still, even during the reign of Belshazzar, the head of the Magi, their wise men, their priestly order. And so you can imagine why they tried to kill him 2 or 3 times. This is a hereditary priesthood that goes back to the foundings of the Chaldeans. And then the king puts a Jew in charge of their hereditary priesthood, an outsider, and makes him number 1. No wonder they tried to get him thrown in the lion's den. No wonder they're constantly out trying to get him killed. It all starts to make sense when you know the story of his life. Now, Darius is a general or a regional ruler over the area of Judea under Cyrus in the Persian Empire. And it says, "It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes." And the word princes is magi, magistrates. 120 magistrates of this priestly class, which should be over the whole kingdom. And over these, 3 chief magistrates. of whom Daniel was the first, that the princes of magistrates might give accountants unto them, and the king should have no damage. Then this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and princes, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king thought to set him over the whole realm. So not only was Daniel the head over the Magi in Babylon, the Babylonian religion, Mystery Babylon, continues into the Persian Empire, and he is still the head of the Magi during the Persian Empire. Now it starts to make sense why 500 years later we have a group of this priestly order who knows what to do with a Jewish king, right? Who knows to be on the lookout for a sign of a Jewish king, that the Messiah is coming. Daniel has conveyed the prophecies of the Messiah to this order, and they come bearing the gifts that he instructed somehow. You don't know the narrative, but it ties the package together when you realize these were the Magi, this priestly order that Daniel 500 years earlier was the head of for about 60 years. And once this star appears, once this sign in the heaven appears, they know exactly what to do. Somehow he gave them instructions. When you see this, you go. And
That's not in the Bible.
that's not in the Bible. Right. The star is not in the Bible. And it's just the connection between them is undeniable. That there is no otherwise. Explain to me why 3 wizards or 3 astrologers just woke up one day and decided to grab some Jewish gifts and travel 130 miles to find a king they just happened to know would be there. They knew this was born King of the Jews, because Daniel told them the true King of the Jews is coming, and you'll know him when you see. And so they came looking. They had a prophecy. They knew what to look for, and they knew when. It's all part of a package. And the other part to call out is, I skipped over this, what it says about Herod when I have it later. Keep going. Following their visitation, the Magi leave. They don't go back to Herod, and we see what's called the Massacre of the Innocents. Herod goes and kills the firstborn of everyone in this entire area for about a 5-year period. That is a massive slaughter. Okay, incredibly gruesome, and Joseph is warned to flee and leaves and takes the child to safety. The reason this is, I'm just going to go on to that. Why does this matter? Why do all of these events matter to our Christmas narrative that's cute and colloquial and has a baby in a manger and is peaceful and loving?
Jeremiah predicted it in 31.
What part?
The loss of the children.
Oh, right. Yep. Yeah, exactly. And he cites that one too. So we have this vision that this was all peaceful and done in a serene Mary and Joseph in a small stable, and it was quaint, and it was I don't know how you say it, but on the down low. That's probably a horrible way. I'm not finding the right words, but our vision of this looks something like the picture, that it was a silent night, that it was peaceful. This was a shakeup. Everything that happened around this was tremendous. Like, this was big stuff. We're talking, keeping in mind that we're in a culture that kept some of the most sophisticated records in human history. The Jews recorded everything, analyzed everything, kept very meticulous records. And yet we see in the Romans, exactly. So you've got a conflagration of the Romans who were doing the same thing, keeping records of everything, and the Jews who kept records of everything religious. And all of this happens in the midst of these two societies. So first of all, you have shepherds going and saying, hey, we saw a visitation that said God is here in a feeding trough, and then we came and found a baby in a feeding trough. So the entire area of Bethlehem is in uproar, right? Something is going on. If that hadn't happened, there would have been someone somewhere who wrote down, we never heard of shepherds talking about going and finding a baby. Like, that is a big footprint. Even just that one incident, someone in the Jewish faith, someone in the Sanhedrin would have stepped forward and said, no, that never happened. There was never people going around claiming an angel visited him and that God was in a manger, right? That's something that would have poked holes in it, and yet we see no record of them saying that never happened, right? 3 people did not go and visit Herod. There was an infiltration from the Parthian Empire of probably a massive army that was big enough that it made Herod uncomfortable. And it says all of Jerusalem with him. Everyone knew what was going on. All of Jerusalem is not shaken up. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled. So the king's scared, and so was all of Jerusalem, because of whatever these Parthians are doing. It is not 3 individuals. This is probably an army that came in.
Probably armed as well.
Exactly. Huge escort. These were the highest ranking officials of the government, probably with an armed escort of hundreds, if not thousands, because they're going into a buffer state to do this. And it was enough that Herod could do nothing about it, and all of Jerusalem is troubled by their presence. If that never happened, it's written of somewhere. Someone says, what are you talking about? There was no soothsayers. There was no wise men that came into Jerusalem and confronted Herod. No, that's ridiculous. This happened. It would have been written if this was untrue, right? This was not surreptitious. It was not on the down low. This was a big deal. Everyone was troubled. When they heard the king, they departed, and behold, a star, which they had seen in the east before them, came and over the manger. This is a supernatural occurrence. Notice what Herod did not say. What star? Right? He knew exactly what they were talking about when they said, hey, we followed the star, and it's over that. There's no record of him saying, what are you talking about? There's no star. There was something going on, and they were understanding what it was. And it followed and went to this place. If there was no sightings, if only these magi saw this star and no one else had, there would be records of someone saying these lunatics claimed to have seen a star hovering over this place, and that never happened. This was a big deal. Like those kind of things, that's not small, that's not trivial. If there is a star guiding and hovering over a place so specifically that they can find the house. This star is lighting so specifically, they found a house in a place of about 10,000 people. Right? We're talking something supernatural is going on, and Herod never said, what do you mean? What star? What are you talking about?
And it must have been like a floodlight.
It had to have been. They
shone
over the house where the child was, not over, they got to the city, and then it continued to the house.
Not astronomical.
And it took them a couple of years?
The journey would have taken them a couple of years. They may have left as soon as, it may have left. It may have taken them, if you're traveling with a large army, that could have taken a couple of years.
A couple 100 miles on foot.
Yeah, at least. And if you're traveling with a big escort, that's a slow journey. The biggest argument is the massacre of the innocents happened, right? Herod believed whatever he saw enough to kill thousands and thousands of babies. Whatever happened, whatever he experienced, whatever these people came and whatever star he saw, whatever was enough that he believed this is real, and he killed thousands. And that is a matter of record. And so you can deny all the rest of this might have happened. There's something happened in that region that disturbed him so much that he killed thousands of kids. That is a real event. Can you imagine how traumatic that was for the nation? That the king just randomly decreed that everyone in a county, let's just call it a county in the state of Washington, that's about the equivalent. So everyone in Clark County, the governor just decided, I'm killing every firstborn of under 3 years old in Clark County. That is a huge shakeup. That's not just a local, terrifying. That's horrifying. The king just decreed, just randomly start killing kids. These people were terrified, and they knew something was going on up there. And I mean, this is not quaint. The entire country is in uproar at this time. They probably all don't know what's going on, but they're hearing rumors of shepherds saying they found God up in Bethlehem, and then a Parthian invasion that came looking for the king. and a supernatural star hovering above that same exact town, and then the king going and slaughtering thousands of his subjects at babies. The whole region would have known something is going on. They don't know what, but this is anything but a silent night and like a quaint thing that happened in a remote corner of Jerusalem. This was a major shakeup. And the reason that's so incredibly significant is you have a line of prophecy that pinpoint this baby to a degree of certainty that is astronomical. And then you have a series of historical events that validate that it all happened right there. If any one of those were untrue, if they didn't actually happen, there would be Roman records, there would be Jewish records, there would be they would have shredded this whole upstart religion right at the beginning for making these outrageous claims that a star was hovering over Bethlehem. No one ever saw that. What are you talking about? Everyone saw it. It was a matter of record, so much so that they put it in writing and no one said, hey, that never happened. Right? That's the verification. He not only lays out his lineage so that you can be sure beforehand, he then validates it so that there can be no doubt after the fact by making this a hullabaloo around his birth. So that if there was any untruth to it, someone would have said. And that's in law, we call that estoppel by silence. If someone would have objected and did not, it's treated as an admission, right? If you say, well, I'm going to kill you unless you confess to that and you choose not to, well, you're pretty sure you're ready to die for it, and so there's this idea that if you would have spoken out, it is evidence of an affirmation, and I have never seen a better example than these huge events that supposedly took place in this region at the same time, and yet you'll never find a record of someone saying, I don't think that happened. I didn't see it. So I think we can be absolutely sure that these bizarre events did take place, or else someone who had massive incentive would have called it out.
So this light was specifically to lead the Magi to Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And Herod had...
And it must have came and gone because they were following it. Behold the star.
In the
And
east.
Herod could have just gone, hey, look at the star.
Well,
Kill the kid that's underneath it.
but he had gotten the information before he found that. Before it went to go over Jerusalem, he had consulted and already found out what town. He went to the prophet or to the priests and said, hey, where's the Messiah supposed to be born? And they said, in Bethlehem. And then it says, once having known that he's going to be born in Bethlehem, what he probably wouldn't have realized is that star is going to lead you to the right room. So he just said, kill everyone. But yes, you're absolutely right. He could have just followed the wise men and been like, oh yeah, that's the house,
So would their army have left then?
I don't think so.
Herod had his own army.
Nope. Herod didn't have any.
Departed by another way.
Herod didn't have anything. Herod was a Roman procurate. He was just a figurehead that was placed by the Roman government. He had no authority, and we see that in the crucifixion of Christ. He has no authority. He keeps having to push it off to Pilate. There's no one was allowed to keep a standing army in the Roman Empire. It was the Romans' army, but you were allowed to govern under your own set of laws as long as you behaved. And so that's kind of the setup we see. They can still have Judaism, but he's a puppet for Rome. And that's why they placed an Idumean, they placed a historical enemy, so that he would do exactly what Rome wanted, because he's in a terrible place. The people hate him. If he doesn't have Rome's backing, they're going to kill him in a heartbeat. So they put someone who's going to be an enemy because Rome knew that dude will do whatever it takes to keep Roman backing. And he did. He was very famous for that. And
What's the Edomites, Lot's
Yep.
grandchildren?
Yep. It moved off, and then it's just there's the sordid tale of the Edomites of the Jews travel through, and they're cheering on all their enemies to wipe them out, and just over and over and over, the Edomites have always been the historical enemy. So much so that the Romans knew, hey, let's go find an Edomite. That'll show them, and let's call the place Palestine. Let's name it after their two enemies.
So when this army with the Magi, all the Magi got into Bethlehem, there were maybe 1,000, more than that? How would they have all Did they stay off in a distance?
No idea.
Just a few went in.
Yeah, high desert. I mean, yeah, exactly. Maybe the individuals just went in. I just know that it's not possible that this was anything less than an excursion, a military excursion, because you're going into this buffer state that's been a war zone for about 250 years with the Romans, and there was enough of a force with the Magi that Herod was terrified, couldn't act against him, couldn't just put him to death, and all of Jerusalem was troubled by they probably thought another war was happening, and they see an army marching in. They see a president. Of course they're troubled. They've just seen 50 years of the Romans and the Parthians clashing within their borders. They're used to seeing this. Of course they're troubled. This is another fight, and yet it's all of the quaint ideas of these three nomads going through, and I think we even have names for them now: Melchior, Balthazar, and what's the I can't remember the third one. But and at some point they went from being wise men to being kings, and not just kings of the East, but now there's lore that one of them was a king of the Sino, the Chinese area, then one was the far north. So there's all this like lore that comes out of them, and it's all just junk. It's all like not reading what the Bible says and not taking the time to understand the setting in which it was taking place. But I mean, I don't know that you can really faithfully read the text and not get the impression that this whole thing was an uproar. Like there's nothing small about this. There's nothing like discreet. It's not a small incursion. This was a big to do in the area. If nothing else, the fact that you just had a wholesale slaughter follow it should prove that this event, the birth of this child, shook a nation. And everyone would have been aware of it. They didn't know what was going on. They knew something was happening up there. And yeah, and I think that is fascinating, both just academically, but also just it's another one of those gifts as the Holy Spirit gives you the tools to be sure. If prophecy's not enough, I'll validate it this way. If that's not enough, I'll validate it that way. But contest it from a historical standpoint when you have some of the greatest historical writers like Josephus and Herodotus writing their histories that are the annals of human history at that exact same time and never refute any of the claims that are made in this text. It's not possible. Like there would be holes. There would be someone stepping forward and saying, I was in Jerusalem at that time. I don't remember seeing a star. They all knew what was happening. So that is my touching and emotional Christmas presentation